more about sort of dogs and maybe what we think Balto is, the direction he's going. Right now, this is the closest that we've actually got to what Simon thinks is the character, and everybody else is sort of saying, let's go this direction. It was Carlos's version, and then since then Carlos has done a cleanup version, which we're obviously, as you start to get down to details and cleanup techniques and all that stuff, you're going to get into a lot of details in terms of our disagreements in terms of what certain shapes. So Simon has asked me to clarify that we don't exactly have the model, but we're almost there. So that's why I'm going to focus on these 4 points, which are first the body, second the legs, third the head, and what it entails, and then of course, just as a final touch, we're talking about the fur and the tail, how they deal with that. What I wanted to sort of discuss was, because, I mean, I personally learned a lot from Christoph's class because of, even though I'd worked on several dog pictures, there is an incredible complexity to understanding how the legs and everything works. When I was at Disney and we were working on a dog picture, which will remain nameless, it was just as, I can imagine how confusing it must be for everybody. And I think that the old guys who were teaching us, like Eric Larson and Mark Davis, they were trying to approach it, I think, from realizing the point that we didn't probably grab a lot of what they were going to be discussing in terms of anatomics and so forth. I think actually we have a better crew than they did then, so I think that's why Christoph's class was so good, because but Christoph has asked me to talk about say that our emphasis is going to be on acting too, so I don't know, did you have that typed up or anything? I can't see anybody, so. All right, the thing that was interesting to me is that Mark Davis was, because of talking about the body, let me just make sure. Mark Davis was basically saying that the same thing that when Christoph talked about a human and a dog, because when they would simplify the human, they would always work with just the chest cavity as a shape. And I hope people are going to be drawing, like, it's probably impossible to see, but it would work with the head, it would work with the chest point, and Mark Davis would always talk about the changes of shape, the areas where there's going to be the most mobility, and the areas where there's probably going to be the least mobility, chest, and then getting into the pelvis area, however you want to define that. And then, of course, where the legs would be going down into the knees and so forth. And then, of course, he always emphasized the eye line. Well, very much the same thing. What happens is that the dog is dealing with the same point. And so you're trying to understand how you can keep from getting too stiff of an action and realizing the flexibility of these animals. You basically take the same idea and you just reverse it. You get into working with the chest cavity, the changes of shape. This is where the scapula will be, working up into here. And of course, I'll try to get a flow here with that. Into the knee, into the heel. And then of course down into the feet. Now, when you start to simplify these things, I mean, you know that there's an anatomic sense we start to study. You know that the knee is in here, and then we're working out into the heel, and then in fact these are the toes and so forth. But the more important thing to start to get into is, of course, how you can use this shape to create a mood. Now, in a human, we know that if we take these, we take this shape and we create a curved shape like this, which they always call the line of action, and we start to break these lines down and so forth, try to create a very sagged effect so that everything is sort of bent. That creates a certain mood, correct? So you get into you get into the linear action representing the body attitude, as well as the reverse will be doing this. And everybody who's studied David knows that that's a great, the statue of David is a complex version of curves and so forth that give it a lot of rhythm and emotion. So the same thing I'm discussing here is something we have to be using in the way we work with the dog in terms of, the mood of the character. And since this is we're dealing with Balto in terms of the whole story is about a guy who can't really be what he wants to be, and he feels dejected. It's a story of persecution, rejection, and so forth. The very first part of the picture is going to be just that, and a strong attitude is going to be simply taking this curved feeling. We're going to be basically using a very sort of submissive sort of pose, and the head is going to be sort of, in that case, maybe even the tail will be, in a down position until he gets around friends that he's going to be feeling more confident about. Now notice I'm trying to, you might even be moving the feet back, or in certain cases you might not get you might bring the certain sort of things together so that you get a more sort of compact feeling. You can exaggerate that even more and more. You might be, I notice that I'm using these just simple shapes to try to create, might even go like this. But that's a very distinct attitude there in terms of, without getting into any detail. I mean, you could basically do this as a rough, and you don't feel so, at least we didn't feel when they were introducing us to this idea. We didn't feel like it was, okay, this I can handle. This I can get into it, and then I start to break down, the details and so forth. And this is before you ever get into the hair. Because of course, as we get into that later, we know that there's going to be distinctive markings that are hopefully going to make him look a little bit like a wolf or a half-breed. Now, the other thing is, of course, that you might, when we get into the positive elements of, just like we talked about the human, in terms of like this, we'll have these classic sort of very positive up poses, where you'll be working with, almost a compressed action, and the head will be way up here, and almost looking around, stretching as much as possible. Maybe the tail will even be up, and you really have this sort of pushing the chest out, and all of a sudden you start to get into another emotion. But you're trying to work with that in terms of, so that you're actually getting a curve in the body in the same sense as you would in the human. So if you try to work with that, that helps. Now, of course, this is not going to be the only dog in the picture. So the other thing that I want to get into while we're talking about these simplified shapes is, I'm just going to push this back a little bit, is the idea that, and I discussed this when I was sort of talking about classes, and that is how you can manipulate, once you understand these shapes, because you're creating a sort of a language, a very simplified language for yourself. Then you can start to experiment with the variations of the shapes, because as you know, Nicola has done some really interesting, funny characters, with very extreme shapes, and well, we're trying to do that, of course, to distinguish the characters. But once you start to realize that you're only dealing with, primary shapes that you have here, the chest is being one, of course, and supported, and there's maybe a handful of shapes you're dealing with, 5 or so. Then you can start to exaggerate it. And when you get into a new character, for instance, or a heavier character, you're just exaggerating those points. If it was if it's a longer character with shorter legs, for instance, if it was sort of with squatty little legs, and it was sort of thick and little tail like this, I'm not going to get into I'm not going to get specifically into a character. I'm just sort of explaining how you can start to, with a longer nose or sort of a dachshund thing that you want to. It's really fat. And you just keep on going all the way through this whole thing and start to analyze your variation of shapes. Now, the other thing we get into now is what we're talking about. This is always nice to draw a dog from the side and to do a walk cycle, but how do you start to deal with these same simple shapes when you're getting into a front or three-quarter pose? Of course, like Christoph said, the problem with doing a front shot and a back shot is that you're looking at a dog very much like a human looking down from the top because of the way their body is, in lateral position. One thing that I found that actually John Pomeroy used a lot was to actually think of it in terms of that vertical position like this in a situation so that you can almost feel that length, and you can almost do something like this just to try to get that vertical position before you even start to twist it. I mean, if you want to get into a situation where you're really going to be twisting the position like that, the character's going to be looking in this direction, you start to get a handle on the idea of the fact that this character is actually much more longer, and thinner, which in animation, can be a dynamic situation, much like squash and stretch, because on a side position, you're going to get a very sort of different impression. The minute you start to turn a shape around and you define a different perspective, that, of course, gives the audience a more sense of believability into the character and start to get into a nice thing. But what it does is also creates problems for the animator, because you have a very complex arrangement of the way the legs work. And I know that the hardest part I ever had was in this area here, trying to define. I won't get into the legs right now in detail because I want to talk about that next. But by using this, you're able to turn it around a little bit better. And if the character was, I'll give you an example. Even if you're working with a grid, for instance, there was a little bit of a down shot like this. By simply working out you work out your chest area like this, but you can still sort of start to feel exactly where, by working with this angle, for instance, I'll just try to lay it in here. Now, Glenn King used to do something where he would wrap actually the neck around. This is a rough technique where you would get the scapula at the same time as getting the twisting of a figure, which helped a lot in terms of in the front vision, because you would get that. Just use points here. You get a wrapping effect around by using the neck. Now we have that advantage here more. He was using it mostly as a fox because it was a very thick thing here. But as you can see in Carlos's sketch here, there's a lot of area in this here. He has this little bush area, which we're going to talk about later in terms of how it's broken up, and there's a shape that would go down into the chest. But basically, if you think of this scapular area here and how the line actually practically goes right into the back of the head, it can help you in twisting the shape. It can help you in defining this scapula. The more realistic you get into a dog, basically you don't really see a lot of this, especially in the huskies, because there's so much fur over the body. But in the wolf, or the wolf dog, much like in wild animals, leopards, things like that, lions, you get much more definition. The fur actually emphasizes these shapes, so you can play with them a little bit more and exaggerate it. And that is the other thing that we really have to do, is we have to think about how we can exaggerate the shapes. So there's nothing worse than being sort of wishy-washy. You want to push it to the point where the audience can really see what you're trying to communicate to them. So you can actually do that, and it helps you define, at least in your roughs. I mean, you can basically do anything in your roughs. I mean, some guys use 4 different pencils before they start to get something that you're ready to clean up. But by defining this, it also helps you. You get to that lateral point, and you're also able to get a little bit of perspective, which helps. I mean, if anybody looks at some of what what, for instance, Frank Thomas did. I mean, Captain Hook, it was incredibly thought out in terms of the perspective, and especially in a dog, you're dealing with nothing but angles, that have to be really defined clearly. Otherwise, it'll destroy the marriage between the layout and so forth. Now, what I started to get into next was trying to say, okay, we know how dogs stand, but how are we going to start to get the flexibility that we want out of these things? So I started to experiment here with some possibilities of how you could work with, let's see here. Now these are a little bit more refined. These are sketches based on discussions with Simon and Carlos, but it's not, the stress again, it's not the character. I'll get into describing that when we get into the face and what we're trying to aim for. But in terms of how the body works, you can see how you can start to work with positions. I have better examples here that I actually tried to sort of animate here. Now, this is of course a little bit more refined than this, but you can start to see how, in terms of working with the body, going down and up, you're always regulated by these shapes that you're working with. And for instance here, trying to work with the head movement up, I mean, probably would be a little bit more stretch here and a lot more breaking up, in the fur and so forth. Again, don't take this too literally, because that was just an experiment in terms of how to deal with the flesh, with the fur, excuse me. Plus, we're going much more for an angle in the back here. And again here, when the character starts to sit down, or this is more like this is more the body attitude that I was discussing before in terms of what he's probably going to be reacting like. Now, for me, I'm starting to get more of an excitement now because of the idea that you can start to take this character and maybe do some funny things, or in terms of relationships. And I remember, and the reason I'm thinking about this is because I remember being taught about how to take a character and actually even maybe turn it upside down, for instance, and using this simple idea of having the chest cavity and curving something up and maybe imagining where the tail is and maybe working into the head, starting to get just using the nose again like this and thinking of, okay, where's the feet here, and just working with these simple shapes. Just put some toes in here and carry that up into this. You start to realize that you can have some fun here with bending the character. Just working on like this. You can get a situation where the character is actually starting to, of course this would be like a falling situation, and get the tail coming up into here. Just do a little smile so he's having a little fun here. And you start to get a lot more life with the character, so you're not just dealing with you start to get more flexibility, you start to twist the thing around, and there's nothing better than starting to get a sensation of how these things can, you can twist these shapes, in other words. You can have a good example is how you can take the front shape, and you can actually lay on the, if you start to study these dogs, you can actually do a thing like this, where the legs are sort of coming up here. Just work the head up here. but in fact the body can be twisted to the side. Coming at you, and maybe another foot like this. And dogs often get into that position because you get so much mobility off of this thing. You can actually, like the classic is where you're dealing with two boxes, and one is shifting, and the other, so you're getting a really nice twist in this thing. And then again, you're getting into the head, so you're actually getting another twist. So you're getting this marvelous sort of thing happening through the character. And then the appendages start to become an emphasis of that movement, which starts to give you a lot of flexibility. If you know what I'm talking about. I mean, then of course the shapes and how you twist these things and what's happening with the legs and and so forth as you get into the. Now you notice that I use these symbols that I mean you often will see me use this symbol for a which is a hangover from Bluth, but I mean regardless of what it is, Simon ends up doing this. The point is that you're coming up with these languages that you can use and help you get the acting fast. So you're not sitting there articulating, just the bone structure. You know that this is a change of shape point here. You know that up in here, at this area where the fur is going to be, you know that you have, that's going to either protrude, depending on whether or not there's a lot of weight on it, or whether or not it's dragging. These change of points, which has often always been discussed, where Milt Call said, we use straights because it's easier to control the character. And that's why they went from going from very soft, sort of nebulous shapes into things. And it still holds true. And Simon is even trying to push that further, as you can see. And again, this is mostly the face. But Simon is again trying to push us to that direction so that we have a better shape that we can control, so that we're not getting into sort of some of the things that we were doing, or I was doing. It was trying to get, you get this fur, and you get this coming down, and you get that, and you get this, and you can get some nice effects, but then it gets into a situation where maybe it's getting too complicated, and maybe it's getting a little bit zippity-doo-ish or something like that. Whereas if you can simplify the shapes, and of course we've been studying a lot of 101 Dalmatians and so forth, the best of the best. It creates a problem because you have to be really good to be able to understand these things, but it's also a challenge. So to keep it from going flat and still making it simple to go through. I better move on to this next thing because I guess I sort of am, because I'm starting to adjust on the legs. Now, the advantage of working with symbols for your shapes is that you're able to control the squash and stretch. And because that's exactly what a graphic image will give you in the show. It's even more apparent when you get into cats because they have this incredible squash and stretching thing happening. But I'll give you an example based on. Where is it? As you get into these things, you start to be able to use this as your, for instance, if this character started to sit down, of course, because this part is not going to be changing much, but this other back is starting to drop, you start to get into the ability of using this just the shape itself to get yourself a squash, which you can also use for anticipations or so forth, whatever you want. The front doesn't change so much, but as you get down here, you can start to see the shape change. See what I'm talking about here? Now, the difficulty that I had a lot was trying to understand how to get, in the three-quarter perspective, how to get this this effect without making it look like it was twinning. And if you, what you basically have to do, and there's a good example here from Lady the Tramp, you have to really try to search for how to use these straights for tension against this curved area here, and then another tension area here. And these, when you get into the front, up in here, you can see how it can easily be, I mean, this is milk hull, so it's perfect, right? So when you get into little people like you and me, we have to try to find ways to get a rhythm to go through there, and it's basically that against that kind of a feeling, so that you actually have a flow going through it. Now, one way you can do it, and these are symbols again, because the more you can create a library of these symbols, the more versatile you get. Of course, you don't want to get hung up in these things, but we always do get hung up in these things. But one way of doing it is, of course, to try to, let's give an example here. One classic approach is to come up with a pose where you can identify the knee point here, and then kick it back, and maybe flare out, so that you just get an indication of where your heel is, and then kicking back into that angle there for where you're going to put these toes. What you get is tension points and relaxation points, which help you to define a frontal thing. Because you don't want to get into a situation where everything is going like this, because that's, I mean, you have no definition, and unfortunately, because the shape of the dog's leg, you can actually get in a position where it's vertical. I mean, where there's nothing there, but then you have no dynamics. So you've got to actually push the shape like in just the same thing you're doing, modeling. I mean, you're doing sketching for models. You have to exactly move around a little bit to get a better position, so you can push the heel out, and that always gives you more, because then you have more possibilities for a squash and stretch and showing the change of shape as you get into it. The other thing which is interesting, because even though we're not going to get into, we want to be very careful not to create too human of characteristics. There is a lot of positions that dogs do that are human-ish, or we have a tendency, as if you're a dog owner or whatever, to look at animals and say, oh, that's very, this guy thinks, and he's got a character and all that stuff, which is great, because that's what we're trying to do in the animated film. And there's things that you can do, like in here, where you can start to try to get into characteristics. I have one sketch here that I was playing around with. Maybe I'll just draw it. It's easy. It was where you can have character down. So now again, I'm just going to animate this character down here on the ground, the chest, going like this. The scapula, of course, is leaning on against the chest cavity, which is at this point vertical, but you can actually lean the shoulder in and kick the elbow out and actually be able to have the thing coming in this direction, while this one, and I'm just drawing that area there. You can have it bring it up over the other leg, and then of course down into your thing like this. And all of a sudden you start to get mannerisms, which are very much like, like this, or like that, which subconsciously will be a little bit human, hopefully, or characteristic that we can start to experiment with. And I'm not saying we're far from having a defined character of Balto, but the idea being that any one of us can start to say, and that hopefully is what's going to happen, one of us will say, this is an interesting little pose, and we have to create a consistency throughout the film, so that if someone does come up with something that's entertaining or human, that's special to him, that we should use it as, steal from each other, basically. I think that's sort of the idea. Any good animators, I'm sure, when Milt and Frank were doing Madame Medusa, one saw one, or they heard Walt say, I love that, the other guy was going to steal it and use it too. So we want to start to experiment with those things. Another thing, which is of course very difficult, is trying to do the rear shots, for instance. But again, if you using this approach, to me, because you're actually defining your perspective from a rear shot, it's much easier to sort of define. I'm going to use it just to create so we can see it. Again, I know that the scapula is laying up against this thing. I'll push it in here like this. Maybe I'll have the other foot going forward here. And we go, this is the bum. But you notice what I'm doing is I'm actually pushing, I'm again trying to overlap, trying to define shapes. And then pulling out this tail so that I don't have to show an asshole. And then going back here down to the head. I was always amazed when I watched Pomeroy, for whatever it is, the films he worked on. He's amazing at being able to analyze how to approach a simplified way to approach a character that is a very complex character. And when you start to grab onto these things, they really help you a lot, you know. And I'm sure that we'll see what he does at Disney is going to be. It's going to be full of that because it's basically an extension of what a lot of things that Milt was doing too. So you can see that you can start to get a fairly decent rear shot without having to struggle too much because of the fact that I was just working with just basically two overlapping shapes. It was able to give me a guideline structurally for the position. And as if I wanted to turn that character around again, I can, you know, it gives me more ability to do that. And then you start to get the way of defining the shapes and twisting them around so that you're using this change of shape to get as much dynamics as possible. And as we all know, the way Simon Boards is he's always using dramatics in the staging and so forth. Now I want to get into, no, I haven't finished yet. I want to get into discussing how, as we get into the feet, how to deal with it. Now, as an extension, I mean, nobody really gets into the toes and things, but we're going to eventually end up we are going to have shots where we're going to be having, I'll just work this out here like this. Everybody knows that this is from the bone structure that we get into these things here. I'm just suggesting that maybe we could come up with, I don't know if we will use nails or not at different positions. Of course, if you're in a crouched position and everything is pushed back like this, and you're going to be. It's interesting because I just saw this morning. I was looking at Christoph had some Xeroxes of Glenn Keane's, but it really does help sometimes when you're using these force elements because you're really forcing the eye to push through things, and so it's really interesting to look at how Glenn approaches things and how much is really worth using. I just think that what this does is actually can give you a lot of, this break area here can start to give you a lot of good force elements in the leg, opposed to just having a straight sometimes. Of course, it even depends. I've seen where they've actually even bent this leg a bit, and you can see it. You can actually see it here where there's almost an arc that goes in that direction. Oops, sorry. An arc that goes almost in that, just a subtle curve like this, and then another curve here, which you can see it also here, We're not going to do this, but this character, but I'm just saying that there's a possibility here. You can even see it here. There's a curve. It's an interesting way of, I think it's interesting that you actually can get that much dynamics out of a curve, out of this going against this. But of course, it has a tendency to push into the thing. You get another squeeze, and you get something like that. And then again, you're getting this shape change too. And then these things are squashing, stretching. But this discussion about going into the feet and how that stuff works is sort of, to me, a lot of theory. I'm not defining. I'm just saying something that's interesting to me when I'm starting to think about animating a dog now in ways that I might get a certain. Of course, if you're going to push it extremely down, if you're going to get into a situation where, I mean, you're going to go for a squash, you might not even see, you might not want to have the time. If it's a fast action, you're not going to want to define things only in close-ups, but still, this is going to give you a lot of squash and stretch. Is there any questions at this? I'm just sort of get into the head thing now. Okay, as we get into the head now. Yeah.
Front legs. Because you did it with the back leg.
Yeah, I think that the way to do the front is to, I'll just do this from scratch. If you're looking at a character that's practically coming at you, and I would try not to do this because I think whenever, like we talked about, it's almost like looking at a human straight down. You have this chest cavity here, and you're going to have the dog. Some ways you've got to somehow, I think, for me personally, I think you've got to, well, besides the fact of trying to maybe turn the head so you can get some kind of something to happen so that you get a little dynamics, I think that you've got to try and push one way or the other. I mean, I usually try to feel where the shoulder is, try to find some point to identify an elbow, and then try to pull it down into this, and then, and of course, you don't want to. You could do the same thing the other way if it was, if this was off the ground, you could take it down, dropping the shoulder, kicking this out, and then again, maybe as if it's going to reposition itself. I'll just try to get the toes in here. And then you have to start to think about the behind how you're going to do that, because you're also dealing with a lot of negative space, so you'd be thinking about how am I going to, is this guy going to bow leg the character? Am I going to do it like this from behind? I'm going to drop those down because you need to. That's the other thing, you have to be very careful about the distance between. You start looking like a horse at some points because you start to get, if it gets too high, you're getting into a horse, practically, so. I mean, you can do things like that when you're lifting, but I mean, generally I would probably try to push it one direction or the other. I wouldn't, I mean, that's the other thing, it's when I'm going to get into the head here, talking about the head, I mean, there's certain things you just don't, certain positions like Mickey Mouse that you just wouldn't draw the character in. I mean, I'm finding that even more and more as we get into the design. I mean, a frontal view of Balto does not look that appealing unless we were going to go for a shocked look. You just want everything to parallel, so the audience goes like this, and you would get into that. But basically, you're dealing with this shape, this wraparound sort of hanging, because like you've noticed already, I mean, they don't have shoulder blades like we do that go along the back. They're hanging from the side of the chest of the rib cage. I don't know if that answers or helps answer the point. Unfortunately, because of this, you have to always, even though you can deal with silhouettes, you're always thinking in terms of, you're always having to think in terms of what is here. And you almost have to make mental notes, indication notes in your animation. Well, this is the shoulder, and this is hanging down, and maybe there'll be a fur up there or something, so you can get some kind of a, I mean, this is not the best poses anyway. As soon as you can start to shift it around or move something a little bit over here, your brain relaxes, because you say, thank God, I got something to work with. And that's or you move it the other direction over here too, you do the same thing. Which leads us to now the head. Now, I'm going to use the same definition as, I was almost thinking, sometimes I did a joke and you'd take a photograph of somebody and just start drawing a cartoon dog over their head, and it was amazing how well that works. But you can take if we were going to normally work with a cartoon human, let's say, that was, let's use typical Disney. Which is based, of course, on the skull anyways, right? You always, again, I referred to Mark Davis, he always said it's exactly the same thing as you start to get to a dog. Because you're basically using the same elements. You're using the fact that there's a jaw in here. You're charactering it, of course. You're simplifying it. The teeth are in here. There's an eye socket. There's a nasal cavity in here. There's a bone on the other side where the cheekbones would be. You're exaggerating what you basically know is already a character of a human skull. As you get into a dog, you're basically taking the same elements of the head. You're using the neck. You're going to be using the eye line. In many cases, to humanize it, you're almost paralleling the human structure of the eyes exactly. Whereas the more you get into a real dog, your skull is in a much more elongated thing here. It's more like, as anybody even sees, but it's because they have a smaller brain, they don't have, and etc. So then you start to work out to where the jaw would be. Mark Davis always said the ear would always come off the eye line, even if you're going up. You're always going to be pulling off of that. Of course, as you get the bottom of the neck and you define the length of the nose and the thickness. And if this is the neck going off into the back, into the chest cavity and into over the scapula point here, and then defining this fur area and how it attaches to the neck, you can start to see that you're dealing with a lot of the same issues. Trying to keep things fairly simple, but can you see what I'm trying to describe here? Now, as we get into that, we have an obvious problem, and that is that in moving the character, we have this incredible piece of mass here that we have to start to really be concerned about in terms of how we're going to move this thing around. And as you can see, again, from Carlos's drawings, the character works really well from a three-quarter profile, practically a profile, three-quarter in every situation. Matter of fact, some of the most appealing drawings are when you get into a complete profile, because you have this really nice dynamic shape. The second you start to get into sort of the frontal areas, it starts to get a little muddy. I don't know if Carlos agrees, he's sitting there. But again, we have to start to play with that. Here, on a down shot, you might get an interesting, this sort of works for me, but again, as you get into the animation, you start to turn the thing. You're basically going to be starting to pull in the eye line, try to define perspective. And again, the first thing you're going to be going for, which is very much like these early roughs I was talking about, where you're just using a line here, for the nose, because that's a very, very critical part of how you're going to be moving this character, since it's traveling through space so quick, so closer to the camera, I should say. Again, we're trying to keep this sort of simple so we can feel that there is a cheek area, little chin, and then we have to connect this area to it here because we're starting to move the character back a bit. Now the other thing is that these ears that are here, often the ears and the tail give you a personality thing that you have to, so the ears might actually in fact turn over in this direction to try to capture what, and the other side they just turn back in the other direction. They're actually going like this or around like this to try to hear what's happening, so that it becomes a very distinct point of its thought process and how it's reacting to its environment and its emotions and so forth. Now then, you might very quickly go, whoops, too big, I mean. And of course, you start to get into this frontal thing, which is you have to be really careful. Because now you're getting into this thing where you've got to turn that over to here, and you've got to define where this nose is going to be. Now this is not exactly right because in fact I believe that the eyes are coming fairly well below a little bit below the eye line because we're trying to push for larger eyes. But I'm only saying this just to try to explain how quickly this nose will travel through space as it gets into a frontal position. And of course, as the way the design is going, and again, you have this muzzle, which is sort of like, in a sense, like you're getting the same kind of variation that you're getting in the chest, in that it's sort of a completely different shape that it appears from the side. Carlos is doing things here. I'm trying to pick up on it. It comes up, and then of course the cheeks and so forth. Again, this is not on model, but I'm trying to use the shapes to try to discuss how you might approach a thing like that. And how important it is going to be to start to mark these positions as they travel through. Now, as we get into dialogue, of course, the change of shape from dialogue. And I'll just do this to try to wing it, animate it straight ahead, sort of. Again, I'm going to start tilting a little bit. Pulling this out, I'm trying to find where the nose is. I was amazed that Eric Larson used to always just use a circle, even if he was drawing Mickey Mouse, that was it, the nose, and he would use that so he could get the movements and so forth that he wanted. So it really gave me a clue as to how important it was. Again, you're feeling this shape here. Because again, it's like the human. You're having this jaw sort of attached to going straight up into the side of the head. Now, there's a question: is how far you can go with these things, with the mouth. I think that you can, in some cases, you can go really far in terms of trying to really stretch this fella, but then you really have to understand where these changes of shapes are. If you're going to be doing something that's really extreme, you'd have to sort of experiment and push it as far as you could, just to try to get this. As long as you were getting the connection, I think you're sort of okay. Now, at this stage, I've started to do it, gone to an extreme case which of trying to take the eye line and parallel. Now this is just for me. This is just for a rough, but it might help some people. Some people have said it's, you have to be careful because it gets too boxy, and I agree. But but there is a way that you can help you define your perspective by paralleling this with this, and then taking this and working out your. So you have an understanding how the silhouette's going to be working at least for the character. And as you define it, as you get into more of the soft cleanup, you can start to, taper things and go up. But that'll get into as we finally get a cleanup person who's going to, or we get a final cleanup model. I mean, again, simple. Should try to keep that. Are there any questions at this stage?
Yeah, I've noticed that on a lot of the design drawings, that it goes from that mouth, it's right at the front.
Yeah.
And then it's wide open. It smiles. Is that just, you just have to wing that?
You mean from a front point? Or?
No, or front or side or anything.
You mean how you're going from here to a smile?
Yeah.
You mean because there's no
You just
distinction?
pop it up?
Yeah, I think that what you have to basically do is, as the smile starts to come up, you actually, you push it right up. I don't think that you would want to. Well, I think a good example is here. You can see, if you look at this drawing, for instance, right here, and you can already see that. Do this underneath here. You can already see that if I wanted to push this shape up here, squashing the cheek and pushing this shape up a little bit, and maybe on the other side too. And then I would keep basically, because this shape is not changing, right? Your shape changes are between this area and this area. So you're dealing with a constant here and a constant here, and a major shape change in this area. So maybe I'll stretch the eyes up and push this like this. So you can start to see that, again, you're creating a positive and negative sort of shape, and then I would just take this line and start to pull it right up like that. Maybe not as big as this, but because it's bizarre, but that's actually what happens. The dogs have very elastic sort of, of course they can't smile, but what they do is that they open up, the dogs will open up way back, and they'll start to breathe, and for some reason it has this bizarre look of a smile. In a real dog, it'll go like, it's sort of like a nut. But so what we're doing is we're just sort of taking the idea of what you see in reality and pushing it up into a small cheek area. It's not a large area because that's not really what happens with dogs. When we started to first research and you start with real dogs and you start working from there, you quickly realize that that the dog actually has a very flat, from the very front point, there's really no cheeks like we see normally, or we design on humans. It's a very vertical thing here, and often the eyes go back, especially on these wolves, they go back, like this. And you have from the side, you have a very sloped looking here, type of thing, and there's no. You just have to. What we're doing is we're pushing it to try to get expression, and change of shape, which is the critical thing. We want to make sure that we can show change of shape to indicate expression. And again, here, the eyebrows are becoming more and more really important element of what his, and maybe also because of the fact that we've been talking so much about, or everybody's been talking about using Michael J. Fox, and you can't help but agree that when you look at his movies, that all he's doing is always like, his eyebrows are down, he's always a victim of the surroundings, and he's, what the hell's going on? What am I doing? What is this? Are you kidding, Doc? That kind of thing. And so you have this look, and if they do succeed in convincing Michael J. Fox to do this, I think that'll be a critical part. I think if we got into another character, and I think that goes with all the characters that you get in, and especially in the face, I think as the dog, and physically, we've definitely got a more boyish dog here, a younger one than we were looking at before. But as you get into a characteristic, if they pick somebody else, I mean, inevitably you'd have to sort of rethink your character and make changes through it, which puts us in a difficult situation in terms of character design, which is why I'm not really that worried about drawing things that aren't going to be exactly that way, because the shapes are going to still be there. But we're at a handicap when you don't have a voice, because you're going to make changes, as well as through the boards. They're probably going to make changes as they get into how he delivers the line. Last, I want to talk about something that we had problems with in last picture and here too. This is, if you notice when you look at this rough, if you look at this hair, it has a really nice sort of spontaneity to it. Bill Call used to get that in his roughs and so forth, in the way that you deal with the fur. It's just got a really nice looseness, and somehow it has a sense of grouping, contrast. You have, nice short, long, sticking out amongst a lower group, and out like this. And there's ways that you can do fur, like hair, so that it doesn't look like a banana or it doesn't look like a spike. Like there's nothing worse than getting these spike effects. But you really have to start to treat it in a sort of a subconscious way, but consciously thinking about how the groupings are. Now, a lot of the worst effects that you can see is when you get into a shape that is just, everything is even like this, or something like that. Even that's got contrast to it. But and then the worst case scenario is Don Bluth, where you actually have this sort of bananas going around, which is interesting. But the best situation you can get to, which is actually, they started working with that, is where you actually have a shape that you're working with, and you can even use the Pinocchio shape, that you actually have a mass of hair, and then you try to create a sense of gravity, for instance. You start to maybe create that there's a weight on top, and then you start to break up into the shape so that you actually have a little bit of variety. Trying to keep it loose so that you actually have something that has a density to it. And since we're going to be trying to work with the dog to have a characteristic that wolves have, which is this sort of funny shape underneath the neck. We want to be careful that it doesn't. We want to be careful that we understand that this is, in fact, that the neck is going well inside here. It's like when you see a wet cat. I mean, you're really amazed how the structure is, how incredibly tight the structure of a cat is, and this fur is just, giving it a completely different illusion. So, and we also want to think in terms of what is the direction of the flow of the hair. So we want to make sure that we're defining the direction. So how far you cut into the fur at certain points is going to really give the audience a definition of, well, what is this? This is a scraggly, long clump of fur at the bottom, as well as here, we're defining the scapula. We're saying that this is going to be sort of almost like a. But you see what I'm doing? I'm almost winging it. There's almost not a rule, because it's sort of something that there is a rule that it has to be appealing to look at, and it has to suggest that it's connected to somewhere, and that there's a grouping, and there's certain breaking points there. And so it's a very good experiment to sort of do this, to sort of play with things, try to create some kind of, curves or things that will give you groupings, and then as you get into the tightening the drawing, to try to create variations, avoiding the point, so that it doesn't become so clumpy that when they paint it, it looks like that, but at the same time, not spiky, so that you're getting into this situation. The tail, also, as we get into that, will be bending down. I think, and this is also suggested by Carlos, is that I think we're going to, like a wolf, we're going to be taking this off the paper. We're going to be taking the tail from the hind quarter, for instance, here, and we're going to be probably. You have to always imagine that the tail is of course, without the fur, is a certain length as it gets into the hind quarter. I mean, it's back in here like this. and that this fur is growing and hanging down into that sort of way, into the direction of the tail itself. Now, as you start to get into that, you start, as I just did that, I start to see groupings. I might have a few loose ones here. I can pull these together. I can grab this together to create a contrast and maybe keep this long and then break it up in here. But if you got a shot where your tail is going to be, I mean, it's going to be obvious, it's going to be sticking out like like a massive area. So, I mean, if you're not careful, that thing can be distracting in either the movement or in the way that you design the shape of the tail. And All Dogs Go to Heaven is a classic example of this bizarre thing sticking out his ass. Sometimes going like this or back or flipping and going into these weird shapes and not necessarily in connection with the thought process of the character. The same thing happens, of course, again, you got the emotional element because you have, this thing the thing can move back, it can come back forward at you and so forth. So you've got a lot of possibilities here for expression, as well as, for me personally, I think that if there's a wolf dog, he's not a delicate thing. He's not been taken care of by any owners. He's probably fairly scraggly. So I would think that, if you can break it up a little bit and make it sort of dirty or something, it would give it a personality that would be. But thinking in terms that that there is a weight process here, that the fur is actually, coming from this thing, and even growing on top, for instance, you can have a fur coming down on either side from this sort of, hose-looking thing. It is 11 o'clock. Is there any questions or anything you can? Yeah.
What about teeth?
Teeth. That's a really important issue because we had a lot of that problem in we're back. Sometimes the teeth were moving along at rapid speeds all by themselves. And other times they didn't have a consistency. I think that a really good example, if you want to study how to lock down teeth, is to look at look Song of the South and look at how they controlled that fox's teeth. I mean, it's an exaggerated thing, but it's very, very good. I think that as you get into this muzzle, you define where this nose is going to be. Then, of course, the next stage is to define how you're going to. If I do something like this, for instance, just to give it I think what we're going to try and do is keep the shapes very simple and maybe just define straights and things like that for whatever. Maybe do a few internal lines, maybe with some skin, sort of like that. I mean, this is just a very rough, but sort of see what I'm trying to do here. But again, it's going to follow the jawline. This is sort of a silly looking, because I'm pushing it like a dentist, he's going to be like that. But I think that what we'll do is work with the teeth, probably, as an upper area, maybe try to keep this simple, straight, so you have the canines, you have the bottom area, and then you'll probably break these areas up as, again, try to indicate some tongue or something that's right there. And then work out the chin area. But then maybe do a few interior lines. I mean, not like we're not saying that it's going to be like to the extreme of Aladdin, where Genie was very. But I think that you can, again, by using the right amount of straights or curves, you can create a sort of an effect that you might want in the teeth and still keep it simple. If that helps at all. Does that help answer at all? What it is? A lot of times I think what we're going to have to decide is that when you get into, for instance, a relaxed or pose or whatever it is, that in some cases you won't show the top teeth, but you might just show an indication of the lower teeth. because I think that when you start to show the front top teeth, you start getting to an aggressive situation. But if you just show two, and actually he's done that here, as you can see. He's used that just in the bottom. It gives you just enough of the image without having to get into all these things. And then if you have to, you start to break that into it. But you're sort of wrapping it around and trying to keep, again, you're trying to think of it as a simple, you know, almost like a shape that you're going to be working with, you know, quite simply like that. And then you're taking the shape and you're breaking it up into something that you can control like that into the mouth area. Again, simplicity is the key thing to try to, you know, because we're going to have this acting teacher coming in here and he's going to be trying to, and a lot of us have been just, you know, struggling just with getting things to move believably or look like a dog or look like a dinosaur or look like a little boy or whatever. And we've got to emphasize the acting element of it. And the more, that's what I'm trying to stress here, is the more simply you can think about the character and build it, the more you're going to be more free to get a performance as we get into these acting classes, or how he's going to be trying to teach us. The personalities, because that's what's going to grab the audience. Nobody gives a shit about how well something moves if it doesn't communicate. And we're learning that quickly, so I think that's it. Unless there's some more questions.
Jeff, you were saying about huskies and the fur around their necks. Do you have any tips about how to handle that?
I mean, again, I've been sort of focusing just on the dogs. I mean, Christoph has done more on in terms of direct relationship to huskies, but again, I think that when you're dealing with I use this drawing that I started with. When you're dealing with, I mean, the huskies have a very different thing, and they have a much more straighter fur, and it's much more, you know, built up around, and the body is much more. It has a whole different leg structure too. So you're dealing with a much more fuller image of the dog. The ears are very different. I mean, if you get into a husky, usually they get into a pointer nose. You have a very different dog, and the image looks like a pig. I mean, it's a matter of building. I could take this, for instance, and try to put it on top. Take this. I mean, the one thing that you can say about if you're drawing over this is that this element of Balto is a husky element that you maybe don't find in wolves. But then a husky might have a much more fuller, especially if you look at Jenna, it has a much more fuller area. And under the skull, what you're seeing is when we get into a situation where they're out with these, when they're out in the snows and everything like that, and they're going to have these harnesses on, you're going to have to cut into the fur, and you're going to be dealing with a whole different thing with the huskies than you would be dealing with in Balto, as these things wrap around, and as they break across the fur. So you're going to be dealing with a whole different image, as well as how the scapula is going to be working. And that's going to be interesting. I think that's sort of exciting when you get into a situation where you're showing actually the internal structure with a prop. It's like someone wears a baggy, thing, and all of a sudden one part of it is a belt tied in. All of a sudden you have a definition of shape. It's interesting. It gives you contrast too, but it also is revealing to the audience, which gets the audience more into it. I think that starts to become more of a husky than this. Again, it's analyzing the fur, and it's a very different type of fur. I mean, a wolf will have more of like a German Shepherd, have longer sort of hair that lays and defines the shape, where a husky's fur has obviously been bred to be more of an insulation factor. And so it has more of a, straighter, thicker at the base. It's got more of a wool almost, I think. And then it's a very different thing, and you have to think about that as a characteristic.
Yeah, on the same subject, Jeff, it's to do with the fur that very appealing drawing that Carlos has done.
This one here, yeah.
when you're talking about the scraggly bits of hair, I mean, especially the ruff around the back of the neck there is something that you get very much more on a wolf than you do on a husky, isn't it? And you can really see the tops of the scapula on a wolf.
I think this area will be much more important than this, because we're probably going to be dropping this back more.
I mean, around just the base of the neck there, because on a wolf, you know, if you look at some of a lot of the animation of the tramp or the wolf that was done very loosely at the beginning of the Jungle Book, you can really see the movement of the scapulas. It's gives it a real sort of moody feel.
I agree, especially when we get into these very depressed sort of mood swings. We're going to have a lot of where the head is hanging down. You're going to have your high point is going to be this. As the head is down here, your high point is going to be the shoulders. So that's going to be a very strong characteristic of in this case, I mean, Balto mostly. So that'll change a lot too, as well as I think that this bottom point here, and that'll have a lot of effect too. Can't think of more because I've been through all my notes. Well, it is 11. So.
Just the nose, perhaps, as well, at the very end of the muzzle, how you're dealing with that, because I've seen quite a few
again, we haven't locked in on that. I would prefer on the original. Right now, the way that this model is going, it's sort of like practically a triangle, and it's very more used to define the perspective than anything else. And my feeling is that at some point we're going to probably have to get into, in close-ups at least, where we can maybe soften it a little bit and get into a nostril or something that can flare, because he will be using his, to me, I think it would be nice, since they're probably going to be painted down anyways, it would be nice to have a dark area that you could use the smelling element of it, because I mean that's a characteristic, and that's also very dog-like, and I think that's kind of interesting, but it hasn't. Anything can happen from this point. I mean, we're probably in most cases going to use this. But when we get into a front, I mean, we get into extreme close-up, and he's sensing, you know, he's going, his ears are going around. He's trying to find where, you know, he gets lost when he gets lost in the blizzard. He's trying to find his way because the steel is, you know, ruined the tracks. You're going to be using everything. It's going to be the eyes, ears, the nose. You know, it's going to be something that's going to be very critical to the acting, so we'll probably extend that. I mean, it's been done before, so. But it's still, it's sort of a, to answer your question directly, it's more of a perspective thing, so that we can, to help, you know, you basically have two color shapes that are going to help define the muzzle in terms of where it's at, you know, all the time.
Jeff, could you say something about the color separation, how to play with this line? Go on the body.
You mean in terms of how we're working with the shape here?
Yeah.
The color shape?
Yeah.
Well, it's been through a lot of changes, but it seems like now we're just going to have a belly color, which is going to go up into the front. That's great because, again, like I talked about the turning of the body, you can get into using the color separation of the character. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, you can actually, you know, you can get to a situation where you can use the legs and you can push a character almost like, push it back. You can push a character back into a nice, and that helps give you an attitude. And then if the character wanted to look in this direction, I'm just going to use that, you get into a nice twist here, exposing getting that nice twist going back. Maybe he's starting to lift up one leg or something, and the tail's going up here, and this, you know, starting to lift up or something.
I think you could even overlap the signs. I mean, for fast move or anything.
You talking about these?
Yeah, this color separation as an overlap, as if it was fatter on it. See what I mean? I mean, the head is turning fast.
Yeah.
So the line would just catch up afterwards.
Oh, you should do that because you're going to get, if it's coming from here, you're actually going to get that neck will whip around.
Not solid, but
yeah.
You know, all this thing, you know, can.
Well, I mean, plus we're going to be spending a great amount of time in the open air, and I think one of the greatest things that you can do is if you can show that there's wind blowing or something. If you can show a little bit of, you know, air in the scene, then you've got even more. I mean, like I said, we don't have we don't have clothes on these things except for the harness and except for the handkerchief that Jenna's scarf that he wears. So what we use in place of that is the fur, the ears, and the color set, of course, and the tail, and the body added to it. So it's, you're dealing with we should be able to have less to think about in some ways, and the key will be to try to find a harmony between all the pieces.
Are the inside of the legs going to have this color?
I don't think so. I think we're going to be only the belly. For me, I would have liked it if he had been on practically half one color, and it would have been nice, but that would sort of been symbolic of the half-breed. But I must admit that it is nice to have separation between the underside, especially if we start getting into these poses like I've tried to describe to you, or try to draw to you, where we can twist the body. The worst thing we can do is if we don't use the color steps or the areas to define.
It'd just be nice if the inside of the back legs or something was white, so that you could get a contrast then with the front legs in front of them or something.
Well, in that case, I would think that we would probably, if the character was sitting down, and again, you think of the front part, because the front part basically is like that all the time, so in effect the front doesn't sit down like the bottom does. I think that if you had this area, the chest cavity coming down, and all of a sudden you saw the inside, and I'll just keep this sort of over here, just indicating the feet, like this, and then the neck area going down, and then I'll just put the head in here so we have a balance. I think that what you might, if we were going to put a color step in cleanup, I think what we would do is probably put a little bit, something like that maybe, to help indicate a belly or something like that. Because that's really what it's, we would have a little belly going up into the chest cavity, chest area here. But again, you're going to have to be thinking about negative spaces too, and how this thing is, and then that fur coming out from the back. And again, if you're getting a 3/4 perspective, you're going to be thinking, oh, well, how's that tail? You want to overlap this a little bit so that you can create it going away from you, Is it going to be twisting in the direction that you want? You have to think about that too. That's pretty big. But that's the situation again. You would discuss. It's just as simple, because here you would have the color step going down the side and going down to this point like that. So you'd have basically something like this. And then black, and then like that. Breaking this up so it doesn't get too. That's a key thing I found, is that if this is too much of a shape, and if you don't break it up, it makes the head look really sort of bizarre. That's about it. For now. Again, I say the reason I sound vague is because in a sense I have to be a little, I can't say this is exactly the way everything is going to be, because we haven't exactly got the model time. We're talking in general shapes, the issues of the parts of the character. Hello? I suppose everybody has this new model sheets, right? No, you don't. Well, it's something that Carlos did a couple of days ago, and I think we all agree that it's about as perfect as we can get. Apparently he went to the zoo and drew wolves and stuff like that, so we got some really nice, he got some beautiful poses here. I love this thing here, because you really get the angular element of it. Even the way the feet are working. Here you can see up in here. Even the interesting poses. You should try to get copies of this as much if you can. Here is some more whole sheet of stuff. The interesting thing is also how well you get body attitudes in here, for instance, and over through here, just by using the silhouette and And fortunately, the way that Balto is being designed is this half wolf dog. These legs are really, and the tail, everything's able to work with the emotion to get as much as you can. It's really nice. I just wanted to show that stuff. This is actually a package that's going off to Los Angeles, hopefully to get approval, because, like I said last week, it's really hard to develop a character until you really have the voice, because things will change. But I'm going to go ahead here and try and talk about about Balto. Basically, talking about the head. 4 points I'm going to hit is just the character design. I'm going to try and act a little bit more confident about the way it is, so that we can draw it. That's why I hope people brought paper. The study of moods, expressions, thought process, thinking, and then etc. We're going through that. So, anyways, try to get hold of this if you can, anyways, because it's really, I think it's just it's fantastic. All the rest of the stuff. We saw this last week, and when I finally at the end started going through the head, but right now I want to start to get into specifics. Now, this is back in February, I had done these studies based on an earlier version of something that actually Don had done some interesting ideas of how maybe a wolf dog might look with a Michael J. Fox type of expression. And I had started to experiment with different attitudes and how you might turn and how you might see it from different angles. But the interesting thing for me is that basically in all cases I was using this simple formula that we always talk about. But what I want to get into now is just that. So I'll come back. I'll refer to this later. Now let's start to, start to analyze. Is it possible for you to draw in the dark? Can you see? No. All right, but then I'll just try to imagine you here. Okay, the way that we're going, and this is sort of a repeat a little bit of last week, is from the perspective angle. The way it has started a traditional method with the circle. Now, we're trying to, I mentioned there was a straight, and in fact what we're trying to do is, even though there's a straight element of perspective on his head from just a silhouette, from just a profile, we're trying to soften it up a lot more now, so that the eyebrows, I'll just use a standard thing here, it's not such a flat box shape, but you have sort of a softened head curve. I'll try to draw where I would think the neck would be too. Now I usually figure that the straight equals the head equals the distance for the nose. And as I said last week, we're using a very straight sort of nose. Now originally we were talking about using Michael J. Fox, so a lot of these sketches that you can see here had a very small lower chin in cases, and it's very much like Michael J. Fox, very heavy eyebrows all the time, always a sort of what the hell's happening look, and a very small chin. And it sort of was getting closer and closer to that. But now we're talking about another actor, so in fact we might be able to play a little bit more with this chin. What I'd like to do in the end is try to get a little bit of a scraggly bottom chin, and then start to pull out almost parallel to the front plane so that we can have this fur that we started to talk about. Now, last week I said you have to imagine that the neck is underneath here so that you know that the fur is attached to that so that you can get some kind of a connection. The other thing that's important, just like if you're doing a human character, is always to try to figure out where the chest is so that you can get this sort of scapula that happen, and you can start to swing right into the lower chest, which you can't see. And then, again, I talked about fur last time, breaking it up and trying to get something that's going to be of interest to you. Now, the eye line is interesting enough. The way that it's going now is actually going below. It's going actually below the eye line because the eye is sort of getting really big. Simon's talking about trying to get something that's going to sort of read in that sense. So you have a very large eye area. And we're still under discussions, but to try to feel that about how to deal with the eyes. But Simon's trying to go for more of a designed format where you're dealing with specific shapes in the squash and stretch process. I always like to even try to suggest what's happening on the other side if possible. Now with the ears, you take that eye line, you pull straight back as if you're going right up into this sort of situation. Because even though we have a color sep area here that defines the cheek, and you can almost think of it graphically like a shape like this that you're going to be able to squash and stretch. And a color sep that's going to go right into the scapula. We're going to, this area here is going to go like that. Of course, take the other area, almost push it like this, going in another direction. You start to get into character. Plus there's going to be a color sep, I believe, going down the nose and out like that. Now when you start to get to a 3/4 perspective, again, starting off the same way, you're still playing on the silhouette, the side, and for me anyway, it's always easier to think of the expression. It's always nicer to, to try to get some variety in the expression. So even though you know that there's a center line, as you start to tilt this thing around, it's nice if you can try to put in some kind of mood in here. Keeps it from getting dead. And as I think I overheard Quentin say yesterday, it's much easier to do a walk if you know what the character's thinking. So even if you're doing something that's static and studying the structure of the character, you have to put a little something in there to have some fun. Again, you have to start to analyze now the tilt and how this nose is working. In some cases, it's really nice just to work with a shape, and again, you start to understanding how your silhouette works. And then you can, this body, of course, is coming over in this direction, which is always interesting when you get changes, because you get something going in this direction, you get something going in this direction too, here. You're getting a change happening, as well as, even though this scapula might not, but you're getting a little bit of this wraparound that I tried to suggest. You can start to again pull in and start to figure out where this fur is going to be coming from the bottom. But definitely things are taking a change here. Notice I'm already sort of thinking just of the silhouette. I can go around, start to wrap the ears up, starting to think how this is working. Now this is going in the opposite direction. This is sort of academic, but I'm working into how we're going to do this. The reason I'm doing this is so we can work into the expression as an experiment. At least we'll go through the thorough process of how to draw the character. Again, keeping the eye shape area sort of over here. Now, interestingly, this, again, I'm going to start to flatten this a little bit because we're getting a little bit more perspective as this thing starts to come around. Animating. What I was talking about is this area here is very, in a sense, you can almost take a line from here and pull it straight up because it's not like really massive cheeks in here unless you're dealing with a real, well, in a different perspective, which I probably can show you later when you start to reveal it. But you're always dealing with this foreground element, this nose. It's always going to be an obstacle unless you use it to your advantage in terms of the perspective that you're drawing the character. But you always have to respect that foreground element.
Anyways, and working into the mouth, a little chin, gotta cut it up a little bit higher here. But again, you're feeling this now, so you're feeling sort of a muzzle shape, which in fact, in a 3/4 perspective, you're going to be using that more, and you have to recognize this and that, so that you can feel this thing coming around. Anything that's going to give you something, a relationship, and the trick about animation is that sometimes you can, as long as your relationships are working, you can almost fool the audience into it being it's a solid shape, even though maybe the drawing's not that technically accurate in terms of perspective. Now, for the reverse side, let me just do this real quick because I think it's important to be able to think of this also from behind. Pop it back there. Again, I'm going for the profile, trying to imagine where the back of the neck, I'm trying to identify the back of the head here. I turn something there. All of a sudden, I'm working just the opposite. I'm pulling this, as you can see here, pulling this scapular line across and over to the back like that, so that I'm playing with these shapes like that. Now I have to take this shape, and I'm going to basically reverse it because we're indicating as here as if this is sort of a shape that sticks out as on the other side over there. So again, we're going to play that out to the opposite. Pull this in a little bit like this. And let the nose go around. And again, using the line to try to help you do that. As you're going around. The other difficulty you have is you're going to play these ears. I mean, like I say, the reason I'm sort of going ahead with this, even though I know that there's things that are going to change, and that there's a lot of, when we get a cleanup model, there's going to be things here that are going to be very, very different. We're dealing with these symbols here, and that's sort of, once you understand how to work with these things, it's going to be easier for you to adjust the shapes to what, because it's sort of a formula. That's all I'm trying to say. I might even show a little bit of that, because that's going to be actually a color shade area versus this. I might show something like that there. So basically what you start to get is your character training. And the reason it's working is because you're working with these symbols and these shapes that you're able to control. Again, you'd also have to definitely where this shoulder is too. It would be now, the other thing, and then I'll just leave these papers on here as I go through here. Now, what somebody said to me is, how do you get from this mouth here up into here, like we talked? Well, you've got to still have to imagine that just like a human, there still is a jawbone that goes back up into this area and up into where the ear are going to be. So if that mouth is opening, it's going to pivot on an axis. And you're going to have the same kind of stretches here that you might find in a human, from the eye down to the side of the nose and to the corner of the mouth. So you will get the same kind of stretch. Now the interesting thing is, I talked to Simon, he says, because if he really was looking up, you might get that flat look there, just to get an opposing action, but I'll talk about that later. I'm just going to do this just so that we can. And again, so this thing is really pulling down, but in relationship to itself. I think it's nice to try to come up with an interesting shape that keeps this sort of this upper lips working. A little bit of tension here. Because what's happening is you still, underneath here, you still have these teeth that are inside the, following back inside here. So you're probably going to see maybe just one here, but get those. You have to think of that anyways, otherwise it'll. And of course, if this is digging in down here, you're going to get this part sort of puffing up. And again, you're going to get a real stretch on this color set area here. Two, three. Can you all see this? Same thing here. As if you're pulling, you're always trying to think of where the static points from the change of shape points are. So if you're going to be pulling down, that shape is going to be going. You've got to somehow suggest how it is. The reason I do this curve down because I actually think it feels to me that it gives a tension point instead of it just being. You know, and it gives you a little bit of a straight versus a curve, which is sort of sometimes nice. Yeah, like that. I mean, this is not an emotion thing. There's no sort of. It's just sort of like saying, "Open your mouth." So he's doing that. Again, you change the eyebrows to make it more interesting, using the same skull. If I wanted to push this down. You don't always have to show both teeth because of the perspective that you have on if this thing's starting to turn around here like that, almost like a box. You can see that shape turn around. Again, this shape is pulling, stretching at the same time. Pulling it a bit. I don't know what we're doing here, but I would like to think that at least that somehow we would maybe try to get some kind of a gathering in here and then puff this thing out from this perspective. Pushing it a little bit, maybe too much. And again, I would want to be thinking about where this, I mean, just like we talk about in live act, when you're studying, you have to think always where the line is going. If it's going behind something, you have to think in terms of where that image is going to carry you. In terms of, I mean, if I have a shape like this and the line's going straight up like that, I mean, this is something where if you were doing the I2 flat, you'd be sitting here and I would be going like this. People wouldn't have a sensation there was a shape that was covering the shape that was there. So you have to think in terms of where these lines are going, and somehow even just a slight curve will give you that intention forward through there. Again. If we're pushing up here. here. He's going to be pulling back as much as he can. Maybe it might even be fun to this combination. How to do an open mouth and a smile at the same time. It's exaggerated, but you might just see it at one point. Definitely, you would have to think in terms of there's a tooth in there, so that when you get into that, exposing that area, you're able to start to get something that's going to work for you. In a way, you'd be pulling up, so you might have to pull the jaw up a little bit. Try to come up with something outside there so you can feel it. Once we start to pump up here. Now, it's nice to do these studies because you can start to experiment, because, I mean, that's the thing in animation, you're going to be thinking about. What you have to think about is that it's going to be the appeal of your drawings, or the convincingness of them, that's going to make your scenes work better than somebody else's, or whatever. Or if you've got to rely on being able to come up with something that's going to be a little bit different. Now again, I've avoided the front shot because I don't like the front shot of him. It's not very interesting. Because when you start to get to the front, you have to expose that he basically has a very sort of symmetrical wide head. It's almost like this. And there's not a whole lot that's that appealing about that to me in the shape itself, except that if you think of it as a vertical shape and you try to parallel, you try to play with that a little bit, you might be able to get something that's going to be able to work for you. This is how I'm trying to get this. I want to think of this too in terms of the angle, the nose. Push one eyebrow up and one down just to get a variety. You get trouble on this front shot. I mean, even when I was doing this, for instance, on this experiment here, you can see that I use the front shot, but I try to use it for a stretch on a certain sort of dialogue possibility that I might do that you might use just in a certain expression. So you're going to have, as we'll get into that, you'll have to experiment with that yourself. Sure how we're going to work with this front fur. Sometimes it'd be nice if there was a little bit overlapping thing. I mean, certainly if there's going to be a wind blowing from a certain direction, we're going to be having to animate it because it can't just disappear. You can't just have it here as a definite shape and then have it disappear as you go to the front. It's going to have to work as some kind of a. Something has to be there. But again, the ears I would think them up the side. Maybe we did one here. Voice in front, straight on. Yeah, it's funny. It's almost like if you look here on this study here, you can see that you actually get this very sort sort of diamond-shaped thing, and then the ears coming up. And boy, that's the only dynamics you'll get out of that is just the audience will be interested going from that shape, or going especially from this shape to this shape. You're going to have this bizarre. Volume here. What's all about? You've got to also indicate you're going to have to realize that it's not just one. You're going to have to, even on your 3/4, you're going to have to, in some cases, you're going to have to pull it around, because this will get into how the ear is going to be turning, which I'll get into next. One more study, because we were talking about teeth and stuff, so forth. I mean, if you just want to experiment, you might even try it pushing this shape up too. I mean, there's a I mean, you can easily work with this shape. In some situations, you're probably going to want to, you know, do something that's going to be very dog-like. Actually, that's an interesting thing. You can use the tooth here to sort of, the canines to carry that perspective in there, and that'll help in that. And I always lean into those perspectives, like you would here. Breaking these things up. And then you can start to pull back with some interesting shapes. Sometimes maybe showing a few gums, get a colored area, but one nice way is just to sort of, start to plow back, into your perspective, so that as you're thinking of going back in this direction, this sometimes works as a nice rough angle, because you can always vary this thing and follow the shape, and not necessarily do all these lines, as well as if you're going back in this direction, you're basically doing the same thing. You're overlapping back into the other direction, which helps you come up with the thing that you want.
We did that on Rex in the last film, and it got into some complication with the teeth on the bottom, because there weren't enough teeth lining up. You had 3 teeth on the bottom and 2 on top.
Well, the problem with Rex was we were doing this. And that's not what I'm trying to say, because you had these distinct things. I think what you have to do is come up with something that's going to be more, in a rough sense, you're just using these lines just as a sort of, just to help you, maybe just because I could put down 3 lines like this in a second, and then go in there and say, okay, now I want to articulate the canines, and then I think it's better to use the shape, is what I'm trying to say. I think it's better to find out, accent the canines, come over here, maybe have a subtle line that can be in between, as long as it doesn't start to, travel, which is I had to fix this one teeth on the scene, and these teeth were just animating back. I mean, it was like it was on a treadmill or something. And you get into that, and
you have to control it. I mean, of course, you have to sit with the assistant, has to sit with the animator, and has to go, okay, this means this, you know. But I don't want you to articulate every tooth. Maybe I want the line to go that far up, and then I want to indicate this canine overlapping in this direction here. Maybe I want one line there, one line there, and then again, you're getting sort of a shape in there that will help you. And this is your silhouette, basically. So you're going up to your lip. So you also get that distinction, like here. I mean, definitely teeth are going to be an integral part because we're going to be going into. I mean, that's all. Dogs. One of the definite things about these dogs, any dog, is that it has these canines, and you don't want to. Of course, the same probably don't want to be an aggressive thing that's going to detract from the character. You want to be able to use it to simplify it. I mean, I mentioned last time about Aladdin and how we could you sort of use that as an example, but I mean that's sometimes going. They literally did do that. You'd have this, and then you'd have these. You just had these lines, all over the place. And, I mean, it works, but that's a little bit maybe pushed to the extreme. The other thing. I think you should be able to also push this thing out. In other words, I think you should be able to get into sometimes a graphic thing where you're actually able to, on a certain shape, like an ooh or something like that, you can actually push a lip out into something. I mean, I'm just saying, the point is that we should experiment with these things and try to find ways that we can, we can play with it. And even though you're going to come back into the shape, I mean, that's the point. You're going from a squash and a stretch. I'll get into that too, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to come up with something that, and it might even get a laugh, Why do you tell, you could do something where you get a little bit of character out of the mouth shape. I mean, we've seen it being done to one extreme at Bluths, where everything is just incredibly articulated. But there's a limit to it. I mean, they would go out like this, where things, that's going too far. But you can do it so that it's a believable, the plausible impossible, as they would say at Disney. Yeah, play with it and see if it's if it's a possible stretch point, because it's always, Eric Larson used to say, you sort of go, it's sort of like something comes down and it smashes and then it goes back. Then it starts to go back up and ends up in a constant again. This is the constant here. But it's always that extreme that you maybe only see for a few frames that can also give it a punch. And you can do the same thing in dialogue. You can go like bam, you can hit out there, I think, and maybe we all haven't done it, but it's an interesting thing to try to keep in mind is that you can bang out from a position and then settle into to this, and the audience necessarily isn't going to remember this drawing. They're going to be sticking around these areas here. So as long as because inertia is the key thing in accent of all life. It's like, I mean, it's the difference between the bouncing ball. The bouncing ball, you have a constant point where you're going, bam, you're keeping up like this and everything, and all your time is up in here, in your high points. But when you're dealing with, I think a character that it's alive, you have to deal with inertia, and that means that something is exploding from within. So you're going more, you're hitting hard out. Maybe that's what the inertia is from the bouncing ball, straight up, the bang. But I think that's what life is. Life is, hey, what are you doing? And sometimes it goes too far, and you get this poppy dialogue where everything is just, bang, like this, and bang, bang, because you're hitting these certain accents. But I'm just saying this to justify going to certain extremes in dialogue. Are there any questions before I go into the next thing about mouth shapes at all? What I want to get into now is more of the study of moods and expressions using the eyes and the ears. I was sort of screwing around with an idea of how this character, that if he reacted to something that he generally heard from an accent, he didn't quite know the direction of the object was at that split second, because we're dealing with, you know, the complexity of phrasing in terms of images, 4 frames you can feel, and, you know, but you're not necessarily seeing it. The character was going to react to a sound, a gunshot or something, or a scream. Now I get very rough here. I want to express the idea. The ears might rise up. One maybe more in this direction, the other actually might be facing, might turn to the other direction, maybe listening that direction to try to indicate where it's coming from. And you want to start to coordinate all these elements here. At the same time, of course, to use the classic opposing actions, you'll open the mouth, you know, to try to get a reaction. You're basically doing a stretch anticipation. But I mean, humans can't turn their ears around. But in this case, you might actually get a situation where the actual ears will turn in that direction of the object, and the back ears will turn around in the other direction. They're actually able to turn and pivot around. So in many ways you can start to use the eyes and the ears as a leading the audience's attention as toward to what he's listening to, what he hears. Those ears practically drag that character over, almost as if they're the best, even more extreme would be if you had ears in a relaxed state, which, as you notice, these dogs often, they can easily be back. And you have the attention point, and then the character starts to interesting for me. I always have to work with the eyes first, because it sort of gets you into the character. You can start to even use this shape in the head to try to do that. Maybe thinking about the shape of the muzzle as it starts to turn around. Maybe trying to play experiment. We haven't even talked about this, but there may be ways that you can play with the mouth shape. Try to get a little bit. Again, I'm experimenting, but now also here I'm able to clear the cheek a little bit so that I can feel this, but then what that silhouette's going to give me is a little bit this puff of this neck here.
I mean, everybody is going to bring things to this character. Hopefully, we'll all sit there and say, you know, somebody will do one scene 1 week, and we'll go, shit, that's really good. Everybody will try to steal it from you. But that's what it's all about. I mean, whatever makes the character come alive, we want to use that. Also, notice how I'm trying to get everything to move sort of in this direction. I mean, it's basically, if this is a sort of curve, we can start to work with the shape itself to try to get that to happen. I mean, it's interesting the amount of emotions that a person can go through in terms of, even though the audience sees maybe one thing, you can combine sort of fear with suspicion. Careful. And as I said last time, you want to probably whip into I mean, to me, suspicion can be sort of this, and then inquisitiveness can give you that. That you actually, not only are you opening up an area to lead the audience's attention into something, but you're combining certain emotions, which starts to give the character the complexity or the classic subtext that a lot of people talk about. Muzzle, so we get to now we just whip that ear around very fast. That's an interesting thing. What you'll find as you start to work with these ears is that there's these incredible arc patterns that you have to watch out about, because the ear might swing around like this. Might come from this position here, come swinging around, and then snap up into an attitude where it's trying to listen in this direction also. So you get this sort of interesting arc pattern as it swings around and comes up. You want to do it to the point where it's fast enough so it doesn't become too manipulative, but it's something that is a problem, and you have to deal with it, because otherwise you'll be cheating too much, and the audience, you know. You should use the ears, is what I'm trying to say, and try to keep it believable instead of tricky, should I? What I would want to do here is try to get into I'm getting in trouble. Try to get over as fast as possible. Side or the other. I mean, this is not a planned scene, of course. This is just winging it. I would try to come up into something that I would think would be a much more appealing position for the character to be in. And since it's in, it's going to be my 3/4. Safer. Until someone comes up with a better way to show off the character. so that I can, you get the idea. Now, when I get into combinations, what I mean is also that you can start to experiment with that. You know that you have an expression like this, just working with the eyes, which is a typical sinister look. With the character smiling, you have all this incredible contrast that you can start to experiment with. I mean, to me, it's sort of like a recipe. You've got, I've talked about this some time ago, is that by bringing the mouth down, you have all these different things. And sort of like most combinations of a lock, somebody told me there was like only 10,000 various combinations, but by combining different elements, you can come up with a million different varieties. And to me, it's like, it's like a spice rack. Maybe you have 8 or 4 different spices, but the combination can give you a lot of different textures. And you just keep on going through there. You start experimenting with, and each one of them gives you a different feeling. But start to get into this format, but when you think about you're reusing things, but the variants, and you have to, if you start to experiment with these kind of things yourself, thinking of the character that he is, using these again. It's of course there's a formula to it, but I mean you're able to throw your feelings into it. You're supposed to more complexity to the whole thing. What this sort of is bringing me into is that how, for instance, if I say that you have a character that goes from, and it's an interesting example, if I say the character is happy, and then it goes into an angry situation, expression. If I sit there and if I say, if you have a happy expression, you go from an angry to a sad to fearful, back to a happy to fearful, and then back to happy, and then you're holding that. In my opinion, you're carrying the constant as more of a happy flow with sub-elements of fear, and you might interpret sad and fear almost the same with a little bit of anger, so that it's like it depends on what the scene is involving, but you have to start to play with those elements of the character. I mean, fortunately, the way that we design these characters, and as you can see here, you really only have the ears, 1, 2, the eyes, and the mouth. 3 crucial elements that you can work with here. But the simplicity of those elements is what doesn't mean that it gives you a limitation. It means that it gives you a broad scope, not just in the combination as I've described here, but also in the combination of motion in terms of what you're showing the audience, in terms of the depth. I missed the acting class. I don't know if you talked about that at all, or if it was just so that you're basically saying that that you have a tempo beat that is overall happy with a flash, an 8-frame flash of insecurity here, and maybe a little bit of a flash of frustrated anger here, so that you actually have a texture, and you're combining this tempo with the subtext, and maybe a slight accent, because maybe at the beginning there was somebody that was he heard something funny in the very beginning, and you might have had an accent point here of reaction, and you start to see that you actually are able to build a sort of a musical pattern for your scene. And if it becomes too repetitive, the expressions are and just as much as they're too formulated, if it's too much stock pose expressions, if you're not showing something. I mean, basically what I would try to do is look for we start to animate the characters, people do something, all of a sudden they start, I mean, I can see it very much in New Eyes. You can see that he does these little subtle things that he does with his expressions that reveal little parts of him. And that's something that that if you're a good animator, if I see somebody do that and you would try to incorporate that, hopefully. I mean, I don't think that we have done it that good. I think that the point is of discussing it is to sort of to feed it into our heads so that we can apply those elements into expression, so that we get as much character as possible. Okay. Any questions? The one thing I'd like to get into now is something that was interesting to me, is using, I mean, this almost feels very sort of academic to me, but I wanted to talk about it anyways. And that is trying to get the squash and stretch during dialogue in terms of in the same sense as many people seen Brave Little Tailor, which is, for me, it was the first time it was really obvious in a Disney movie that they were using emotion to play with dialogue. In other words, that a character would be in this position, for instance, and about to say a word, and I'm just going to use a very simple sort of thing like this. They would actually use use the action, the head movement itself, to play a good stretch, so that you actually have the dynamics of pulling the shape, at the same time as getting a good stretch, so that you're actually playing a line out. So that you're actually getting the squash and stretch out of the dialogue itself. Now, Pomeroy did a lot, and basically he was just trying to copy Frank Thomas, and it was sort of interesting because it all comes from the same thing. It's trying to get the third element of the relationship changes that are designed into the character to play for you in your dialogue, so that you actually, I mean, look to the extreme, as you can see, he was like, everything was like, how are you? It was like that. Everything was stock. But then again, you look at Frank Thomas when he did Captain Hook, and he would sit there and he would do the exact same thing, but with honesty, he would go, he would do a thing where he goes, where he would go, Pan, Spanish Tinkerbell, like, and he would pull the dialogue down pulling it into as if, almost as if it was the words were pulling the character into a statement, when you were basically just getting this very simple, nice and squash and stretch, and the character would end up into this is a squash pose with a closed mouth, and then we get up into he would end up into this type of thing there. I mean, if anybody who's seen Nim, seen the owl, and he goes, "Why have you come?" I mean, there's a classic, why. Not only was he getting this stretching, but he was also getting this thing he was into, where he was articulating the arcs on the lower beak. In fact, that's what he was doing. He would not just take the dialogue and open a mouth, for instance. He would not, in the case of the beak, for instance, like that, he would not just open for the stretch and pull it down, like in this situation, but he would actually arc the bottom chin around to try to give it a chewy effect, which was something that he was experimenting with. So it was actually rotating wide, into these sort of articulated, distinct patterns, which it's okay if you don't use it too much as a gimmick. As long as it's a characteristic, I think you're safe. But you can play with those things, and as you get into a dog, and especially with these distinct things that are sticking out in front of you, you're going to really have to play with these arc patterns. So it might work. I mean, it depends on, it also depends on if you have how much of the note or the voice sound is carrying, if it gives you enough time to actually do a, sort of an arc pattern instead of just using, a straight up and down pattern for opening and closing. That can also get very boring. People can look at that and, it just gets very like a puppet flapping around. It's nice if you can get an arc pattern, get a stretch arc pattern, and then maybe the bottom, you can tilt the head so you get a little bit of a pattern, a turn, smooth, something a little bit more appealing to look at. Is this dialogue that I'm talking about, all these things here, is that sort of the connecting, am I being too abstract?
I just wanted to ask a question, really. I mean, you're talking about head tilts now and things. I mean, for me, when I'm trying to work out how to place a piece of dialogue, and obviously talk about it in two general terms, because every scene has its own specific emotions. But with head tilting and ups and downs, I kind of get into a sort of mental dyslexia about when it should be up and when it should be down. I mean, you can go through an act out of scene on your head, and I still sometimes get confused about whether where the anticipations of the downs should be or the ups. And before you know it, you've lost touch with the freshness of the acting you're trying to put into the scene. It's become a mechanical nightmare.
So that's what I mean when I was talking about here, when I was saying that you have a constant here. I mean, it's not just when you stage your scene, I think you're not just thinking in terms of the happy mood, you're also thinking of that perspective that you're trying to play that happy, or whatever it is. And so what I'm trying to say is that you play, generally, if you've got a character scene playing in this direction, and you want to have a sort of submissive thing, and you're trying to play it 3/4, so you keep the head sort of down, and you want him to be looking sort of up, but almost be able to play away, and he's insecure, but yet he's sort of trying to keep a stiff upper lip and a smile here. And like this, I think that what you do is you stick with that throughout the scene, but what you move is move in and out of it in terms of your accents. That you're actually practically going to end you're always going to be using this as your key point. You're even going to keep those ears down, and not just down, but maybe turn away from her or something like that, unless there's a point, if he's talking to Jenna, for instance, and he doesn't think he's got a chance in a million years to get together with this dog, and so he's never going to. You think of that primary point, and then as you start to go through your dialogue, you're working in and out of it. So it's like if I don't want to look at you, I'm sort of doing this, and then you might have a moment of courage, and you might explode up like that, and that's going to be pulling you up. And then you can start to use the appealing elements of stretching the dialogue, and then snapping back, and then looking up, and then you start to play, but you're always playing down, opposed to the other way. If you're very arrogant, you're up like this, and you don't give a shit about anybody. How you doing? Hey, I got a good time. You're going. I mean, you're thinking of something else, and that becomes the overall point. Because that can be a trick. Is if you're just thinking about, if you're trying to come up with a formula, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. I'm showing you that there's approaches, but you've got to think of the one theme throughout the scene, the mood, and then you vary up and down, or to the side, only as subtext of it. And that enables the audience also to lock onto this thing. Because if you're moving around too much, I mean, even when I did this experimental animation with these different voices for Balto, I mean, basically I was over animating. I was sort of just, I mean, sometimes I did, but normally, I mean, because I was just ad-libbing. And a lot of times when you're ad-libbing, you're just doing a lot of things. And that's the point of rehearsing, I think, a line. And I hope that we get into rehearsing more the play before we actually start animating during this period. Because it gives you more ability to analyze, I think, the thing that is the drawing that's going to carry the scene. And then the other drawings that are going to be either the accents or the revealing part of his character are only are sort of, you just are there, you know what I'm saying? It's like spaghetti, but why is it somebody makes it better than somebody else? Because, you know, throw in a little subtext and, you know, a little garlic and a little this and a little that. Next thing you know, you got something that's really alive, and not just, dare I say, made from the dirt. So that's where does that help answer?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, either way, I mean, you always talk about this, I mean, about the act, you have to feel and believe the character, and I think it's, inevitably, it has to be something that becomes an honest spontaneity, because that's your own timing, that's your own feelings, and so forth. But there are certain things that you know, you hold to be true. I mean, I was talking to Christoph and Rob, and we were all saying that, you know, we can all sit down and we can study anatomics. I can sit there and explain to you a million times what, you know, the relationship between the eyes and the cheeks and all these technical things. We can study the dots, which is what we should do in everything. But whenever we seem to get down and talk about acting, everybody goes like, well, I just sort of do it, you know. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. You know, or the director never likes what I do, or, you know, it's like, you know, and that's not necessarily a true thing, because there is certain things, you know, the classic story about, you know, Olivier working with Dustin Hoffman, you know, and not understanding he didn't understand what Dustin Hoffman was doing, and because he planned out everything, you know, he staged everything, you know, and then he played it where Hoffman was never really, he just got into the character, tried to be the character, tried to be the flower or whatever he wanted to be, you know. It's a different approach, but I mean, inevitably, I think that even Olivier, when he got out there, he was feeling it, no matter how much he planned. We have to plan because, you know, we have to draw ourselves and explain a lot of the physics of the character. We have to explain the gravity, and you know, we have to turn things. There's so many things that an actor doesn't have to do, because he can be the character. He can go into makeup, he can put it on. You know, he has to live with his character. I mean, he has to play character roles when he gets old. He can't. You know, we can do anything we want, but we have to also be able to control that. I mean, I think a very good comparison to Olivier and Dustin Hoffman is like Frank Thomas and Milt Kahl. I mean, here you have Milt Kahl is very, you know, sophisticated, you know, very technician with a great sense of humor, a great drawing ability to entertain you with dazzling. He was a far better draftsman than Frank Thomas, but it's arguable that Frank Thomas was maybe a better, more emotional actor, you know, and that's the thing that we have to deal with. You know, it's always a combination of how far do you get close to the technical element, but you're not losing the emotional element. And like Christoph said in the memo, I mean, we have to get the feeling. That's important.
I know Frank Thomas spent a lot of time thumbnailing. It's in the Illusion of Life, for example. Thumbnails, we don't really know that.
Well, I mean, I've seen a lot of Milt Kahl's studies, and most all of his scenes were done as thumbnails on a big sheet of paper. But he was actually planning out it. There's more. I mean, I've been through that stage where I've done it myself, where you write down. I mean, these could be thumbnails, and you write down. Then you're actually in your thumbnail saying, I'm going to be here for 12 frames, and then I'll go zip down here and come back up to this and hold that for 16 frames. And you start to plan out everything technically to the point where, you know, I mean, he's a master of controlling every technical element that Milt Kahl that you can imagine about animation, you know, and making it work. I mean, I don't know an animator that still doesn't try to do technical elements, but nobody seems to do. I mean, Frank Thomas used to say to me and to all of us when we were there, he says, you know, I don't know what appealing drawing is. I just know that when it's appealing, it's appealing. You know, but I think in a sense he was talking about sort of, you know, the performance of the character too. You know, and that's got to be in here. I mean, when I'm drawing this, regardless, I have my own feeling about what this character's thinking. You know, I have this certain. I mean, I was describing to you a thing that he's looking at Jenna, and that's basically what I'm feeling it is. The situation and the script itself will present itself and clarify that fact to the audience. You know, that out of context it doesn't necessarily work, but you know, as I start to play it, feel it, and I'll start to reveal the subtext. You know, hopefully the audience goes, yeah, I know that, I felt that. I mean, I guess.
Jeff, and
when you were talking about some rules and tricks that that you're usually using, I mean, there's also the point that that we should look for different tricks or mannerisms that are human and that we could adapt to a dog, as you know, for to play with the shoulders or any attitude that we could think of, or even wings in the eyes or stuff like that. I mean, that you know, the way that humans are moving with their, I mean, talking with their hands and everything. Of course, the dog is not going to talk with his hands, but we should try to find something which is as expressive and obvious as that.
Well, I think there's a lot of things you can do actually with the front paws, because you actually have a. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, even though it can't go out like this, because it doesn't have the placement is on the back. It's a completely different structure of the rib cage. There's a lot of things you can do with the front. You can wipe the face with this and go forward. You know, it can do that. The dogs will often go down, and they're actually the scap. I mean, you can lean into it like you could actually take, for instance, like this. You can actually lean this point in, you know, to the point where actually it's the arms going forward and actually going almost away from you like that. There's things you can do to try to, you know, to give it an interesting gestures. I mean, that's actually breaking the shoulders actually here now, breaking it in, and it's actually going in that direction, you know. But I don't know if it's just me endowing animals with certain human characteristics, but well, I'd say I see that. I mean, my dog is, you know, can manipulate me just as much as any human can. I mean, she can turn around. You know, I notice when, you know, when she wants to get sympathy or something, you know, the way she'll go, like, you know, she'll try to act like she's, you know, like this, and look up real fast, you know, and try to get your attention, or you know, or just, you know, jump, or she'll literally go, you know, just run out and just go, well, what do you say? Let's go. You know, it's sort of like, you know, what's the difference between a dog jumping and then going, let's play, or a guy going, well, let's go out and have a few drinks. You know, it's like you get into these things where I think it is. I mean, the difference that that we can't do is that it's primarily, to me, is the ear. We can't sit there and do this, you know, show emotions by doing that and going up and, you know, or, you know, have one ear down and one ear up, like, you know, I'm not sure. Or they can do that, and that's, you know, those are the things. But I think that eyes are really critical. I mean, you go to you know, look at an ape or a chimpanzee in the zoo, and you start to wonder, you know, is this right? You know, should they be in that cage? They seem like they're pretty intelligent as beings. And I mean, on the scientific element of it, studying, they get more and more the scientists study animals, the more they realize that they're able to think and, you know, understand things. I mean, there is within a limitation. So I think all we're really doing is it's very easy for us to put human emotions into these guys, because I think that in a sense, I mean, we're all part of the same life form in a sense. And there is essence of it you can see. You know, characteristically, I think that the important thing we're going to do is try to find the character in your actor and try to apply that in there, because, I mean, the problem is we're not really stage actors, so, you know, we don't have a specific style. We have to jump from characters to characters to characters. Whereas an actor, like I said before, is stuck with a certain physique that he has to deal with. You know, to a certain extent, he can look like the Elephant Man if he's got a lot of makeup, but he still is to project himself. And I think that's the thing that we have to try to do is apply. You know, look at that actor he will carry certain characteristics from role to role. That is, it's very difficult to separate. You know, Sean Connery, even though he can be James Bond, or he can be, you know, in a number of movies, you know it's still him. He still has certain characteristics. And I think the more we play on that, you know, we can put that elements as well as things we want to add ourselves into the character to make it consistent. But I think we have to stick together in terms of all the animators. On Balto, we're really going to have to say, you know, hopefully all the animators will come up with something fresh, at least in a few scenes of the picture, that we'll all be able to say, you know, agree, let's use that. You see so-and-so did this, and he gave him sort of a twitch when he wasn't really sure. I think we should or whatever it is, I think that we should try to copy those things because the ultimate dream would be as if one animator, or Phil's dream would be as if you could do, I could do one animator could do with a whole character for the whole movie, but it's not very practical unless the character is only in about 100, 200 feet, the movie. So we really have to coordinate, I think, which is why I'm discussing this because, hopefully if I'm going to be able to come up with things that you'll be able to emulate, and as well as not just feel that you're being told what to do, but that you'll be able to embellish it too in different sequences.
You mentioned the feet. Do you have any kind of design for the feet yet? We've seen lots of different things.
I would stick to, we don't have a cleanup model sheet, no. But I think we're going to try and keep, to me, that the internal shapes are something that we can play with, but I'm going to stick with the silhouette shapes. As far as I'm concerned, I think the proportions of the size of the feet and in as much as it's been caricatured to a wolf, it's perfect. How we internally define, the shape might be broken up like this, but then it comes, and you have a silhouette shape. How we break up the toes and the, trying to not to twin everything, maybe trying to create a little bit more of a flow through it. I think that's something that we'll get into in cleanup. So that I was looking at 101 Dalmatians last night, and I was surprised that they actually had the feet on held cells, and they only animated they would often use held cells for the legs when he was in the opening scenes, Milk Call scene, the arms. When Cruella drives up and they're sitting there on the door sill, the arms are a held cell. The only thing that's moving is the character itself, and that's a hell of a lot of confidence people. When you look at it, you can see it. They really did. So I think we'll probably try to get the most appealing positions. We're still going to have to be squashing and stretching. The contact points will, just like a foot. We'll want to get into a squash and a push, and as the toes push up, and as there's as we start to stretch something, it's going to be, you're going to get a lot of spreading of the toes, for instance. You're dealing with that sort of a thing where you actually have, squashing and stretching and spreading and contracting, as well as if here's the example like here, where the foot is dragging back. We're just going to have to be showing using those toes as best as possible to articulate the bottom side of the foot. I don't know if they're going to put color steps for the paws or underneath, but I doubt it because I think we're trying to keep our correction that's a little bit more clean looking. Does that help on the feet? But I would basically my answer is to stick with the relationships. That's why I think the silhouettes here are great, because if you stick to the silhouettes, the internal problems will solve themselves because of your understanding of the character design, and you can feel exactly where the hind quarter is and how it's moving. To me, anyways. Is there anything in particular that you'd like me to focus on? In this area, that you felt that it wasn't clarified. What do you think? Or that was too brief on it, you want me to elaborate on it? Is there anything you can think about that you're having problems with, you will be having problems with? Or maybe something, is there any part of the head structure that maybe...
Just where the ear actually attaches to the head. Where that pivot point would be.
I think that the important thing to think about, again here, as you can see, you actually have to stretch this back because the ear itself, see over, we'll just sort of try to clean this up a little bit. The ear has this thing where it's attached, there's a muscle points here, and then there's an muscle point basically, it's right about in this area here. And this is able to, if it's pulled up in a very attentive position, it's going to be attached in here, and it's going to be pulling up in that direction. So basically, even though we have an overlapping shape here that is sort of coming over the head and then down to this, to where the color step is, this is sort of a shape that twins over here, it goes around the character. You're basically going into the ear at this point. So there's definitely a cavity here, and the ear goes back. Now, as you turn that thing, it's going to, you want to use those hinges, so you're going to be, if it's going to be coming this direction, you can do that and start to play on this, and then pull this back like that. I think this is the best way. What you want to try to do is also try to create a straight versus curve. From the back point here, I would say that you're trying to find that equal point over here. You like to try to, the back has a distinct, sometimes cone back shape here, in as much as that, as this turns around and away from you, you start to get something like that. Because you're actually getting this shape, and you want to sort of, the only way you're going to be able to identify that shape is by having some kind of overlap. But then at least you're able to feel the thing as a shape inside there. I understood a lot better when I did that little sculpture of an earlier design of him, because I was able then to sort of see that especially from the back, you know, you can really feel from a back position that there's the back of the ears and how it comes like that and up into this shape there. Do you know what I'm saying? So you really start to, and then the perspective starts to blend out and go to the point. Again, here you're going to get that sort of effect. I mean, this is just if you're doing a map of the surface area. But as this ear would come down, or as my dog, for instance, can turn its ears around practically, she can twist her ear so that it's practically, you know, she can catch an ear sound from behind, or pull it back in a way back here like this. Then you get into difficult perspective problems because you have to do this. You have to pull from a contact point around the front. You know what I'm saying? Pull it back. I mean, with Tramp, it was different because they had the contact. You had this shape here. It started to cone up like that, as if it was going to a point. But in fact, then it tipped down into a nice. Then it could just overlap it. So you always had this overlapping thing here. You always had this flap, flap, flap with a very stiff area base here. We don't have a flat point. What we do though is the rotation of the ability to be able to turn that thing around. Basically, it's these. Because it's gristle, right? And the gristle is able to move from muscles inside the head. So it can, this thing can do that. If you're going to, you know, sort of, you're going to do what you want to do is try to do that shape going around. And still get the surface of the head being, you know, so that it's attached to the head. I think we're going to have to do something in that direction. Otherwise, you know, we're just going to be getting, you know, this very cut-out-looking ear. That's not going to help us.
We'll take a break.
I think that's about it, actually. I'm good for an hour and a half. I don't know about you guys.
Good. Thank you.